Welcome to our journey, exploring one of the most fascinating aspects of the Beatles' legacy, how this legendary band from Liverpool wove historical references into their songs. Though the Beatles are famous for their love songs and psychedelic experiments, not many realize they also documented important moments in history, both from their own era and from times long past. The Beatles weren't just pop musicians creating catchy songs. They were artists deeply aware of the social and political environment around them. From the civil rights movement in America to the glamorous lives of London socialites, from Victorian circus posters to complaints about oppressive British taxes. All of these became sources of inspiration for John, Paul, George, and Ringo. What makes the Beatles' approach unique is how they conveyed these references. Unlike protest folk musicians who were blunt and direct, the Beatles tended to use metaphors, symbolism, and veiled references. They didn't shout about social issues. They wrapped them in beautiful melodies and poetic lyrics that required listeners to dig deeper to understand the true meaning. In today's narrative journey, we'll explore 6 Beatles songs that have deep connections to historical events or figures. Each song has a backstory that reveals how this band responded to the world around them, and how they transformed newspaper headlines, old posters, and historical moments into timeless works of art. Let's begin our journey with one of the Beatles' most powerful songs, a song born from deep concern for human struggles across the Atlantic. The year was 1968. America was in turmoil. The civil rights movement had reached its climax. Martin Luther King Jr. had been assassinated in April of that year, triggering riots in over 100 cities. Racial segregation was still a bitter reality in many states, especially in the South. Black American women faced double discrimination because of their race and their gender. Amid this turbulence, in a studio in London, Paul McCartney sat with his acoustic guitar. He had been following the civil rights movement with great attention. Like many progressive young people in Britain at the time, the Beatles cared deeply about the state of the African American community. They themselves had been greatly influenced by black music, rock and roll, blues, R&B, and they knew they owed a debt to that musical tradition. McCartney began writing something different from the usual Beatles songs. This wasn't a love song. This wasn't about the band's life. This was a message of hope, directed at someone very specific. A black woman in America struggling against oppression. The song that emerged was Blackbird, one of the Beatles' most minimalist yet most powerful compositions. Just McCartney's voice and his acoustic guitar, plus bird sounds in the background. But this musical simplicity concealed an extraordinary depth of meaning. McCartney later revealed his intention very clearly. He said that what he had in mind was a black woman, not a bird. These were the days of the civil rights movement, which all of them cared passionately about. This was really a song from him to a black woman experiencing these problems in the States. An encouragement to keep trying, to keep faith, because there is hope. But as often happened with McCartney's works, a veiling took place. Rather than saying specifically, black woman living in Little Rock, and being very explicit, he transformed her into a bird, made it symbolic, so listeners could apply it to their particular problems. This was the brilliance of the Beatles' approach. By using the metaphor of a bird, a blackbird with broken wings learning to fly, McCartney made his song universal. Yes, it was about the civil rights movement. Yes, it was about African American women. But it was also about anyone who felt oppressed, anyone waiting for their moment to rise. The lyrics are deeply poetic and full of hope. A blackbird singing in the dead of night, taking broken wings and learning to fly. All its life, this bird was only waiting for this moment to arise. This message resonated not only with the African American community in 1968, but also with generation after generation of listeners facing their own challenges. What makes Blackbird even more meaningful is its timing. The song was released on the White Album in November 1968, just 7 months after the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. For many Black Americans listening to this song, McCartney's message of hope came at a time when it was desperately needed. Interestingly, many Beatles fans didn't realize the true meaning of this song for years. They enjoyed it as a beautiful acoustic folk song about a bird. Only later, when McCartney revealed the actual inspiration, did people begin to understand the depth and courage of this song. Blackbird shows how the Beatles, despite being a British band based in London, were deeply connected to global issues. They weren't isolated in their celebrity bubble. They cared, they paid attention, and they used their platform to convey important messages, albeit in subtle and artistic ways. To this day, Blackbird remains one of the Beatles' most beloved and most frequently covered songs. Every time someone plays it, they're not just playing a beautiful melody. They're voicing again that message of hope for those still struggling, waiting for their moment to rise and fly. February 1967. Paul McCartney was having breakfast, reading the Daily Mail as usual. His eyes caught a headline. A high-achieving girl dumps her car and vanishes. This was the kind of story that often appeared in newspapers. A teenager from a middle-class family suddenly running away from home, leaving her parents in confusion and panic. But for McCartney, this wasn't just sensational news. This was a window into a universal family drama: the generation gap, loneliness, the search for identity, and the inability of parents and children to truly understand each other. He began imagining, what might have happened? What was the sequence of events? What was in the girl's mind? What did her parents feel? The girl in the story was named Melanie Coe, 17 years old. She came from a family that seemingly had everything. Her parents gave her everything money could buy. But as often happens, money couldn't buy happiness or a sense of belonging. Melanie was an only child and felt very lonely. One morning in February, she decided enough was enough. She left a small note and departed. McCartney, with his extraordinary storytelling ability, took this story framework and transformed it into one of the most touching ballads from the Sgt. Pepper era. She's Leaving Home wasn't just a story about Melanie Coe. It was a story about thousands of young girls in the 1960s who felt alienated in their own homes, searching for freedom and meaning in a rapidly changing world. What makes this song so powerful is the dual perspective McCartney employed. We hear the story from the girl's point of view, quietly leaving in the morning, leaving a note she had probably prepared in her mind for months. But we also hear the desperation of her parents, especially the mother, who couldn't understand what went wrong. We gave her everything money could buy, they lament. And here lies the tragedy. Parents who genuinely care but don't understand that their child needs something money can't buy. Musically, She's Leaving Home is also unique. This is one of the few Beatles songs that doesn't feature the band itself playing instruments. McCartney used a classical string ensemble, creating a melodramatic atmosphere perfect for this story. The arrangement of harp and strings gives the song a cinematic quality, like a soundtrack for a film about middle-class family tragedy. But there's an extraordinary twist to this story. It turns out Melanie Coe wasn't a stranger to Paul McCartney. 4 years earlier, in 1963, she had met McCartney on a music television show called Ready, Steady, Go. Melanie won a miming competition to a Beatles song, and McCartney himself was the judge who presented her with the award. Imagine the irony. In 1963, Melanie was an enthusiastic young girl winning a competition mimicking her idol. Paul McCartney gave her the prize, smiled for the camera, and then continued his phenomenal career. 4 years later, unknowingly, he wrote a song about that same girl. The girl who was now so unhappy, she ran away from home. McCartney had no idea he had met Melanie, and more surprisingly, Melanie herself didn't know the song was about her until years later. She heard the song when it came out and thought it was about someone like her, but never dreamed it was actually about her. Melanie later recalled how accurately the song described her life. The quote from the parent saying, "We gave her everything money can buy," was exactly true in her case. And the line, "After living alone for so many years," really struck home, because she was an only child and always felt alone. But there was one detail that didn't fit. In the song, the girl runs off with a man from the motor trade. Melanie didn't do that. She later commented with humor, "I can remember thinking that I didn't run off with a man from the motor trade, so it couldn't have been me." This small detail shows McCartney's creative approach. He wasn't making a journalistic documentary. He took the framework of a real story and filled in the details with his own imagination, creating a narrative that felt authentic and universal, even if not 100% factual. Melanie Coe eventually returned home 10 days after she left. Unlike many runaway stories that end tragically, hers had a relatively happy ending. But McCartney's song captured that transformative moment, the moment when a young girl decided she had to take control of her own life, even if it meant leaving everything behind. She's Leaving Home is a perfect portrait of the 1960s era, an era when the young generation began rebelling against their parents' values, seeking freedom and authenticity. It's a story that resonated not only for Melanie Coe, but for an entire generation who felt alienated from their own families, searching for something more than a safe but suffocating suburban life. January 1967. John Lennon was taking a break from filming the promotional video for Strawberry Fields Forever in Sevenoaks, Kent. He stopped by an antique shop, the kind of shop full of treasures from the past, objects carrying stories from eras long gone. Among the stacks of antiques, Lennon's eyes caught something extraordinary, an old circus poster printed in 1843. This wasn't just any poster. It was a colorful Victorian typographic work of art, advertising a circus show called Pablo Fonque's Circus Royal. The poster was full of amazing details about the attractions to be featured. Lennon was fascinated. He saw the poster not just as a historical artifact, but as something he called cosmically beautiful. He bought the poster cheaply and took it home. But what he didn't realize at that moment was that this poster would become the blueprint for one of the most imaginative and psychedelic songs on the Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band album. At that time, Lennon was under pressure to produce songs. The Sgt. Pepper album was in production, and he needed a strong contribution. He later explained that he wrote the song as a pure poetic job. He had to write, because it was time to write, and he had to write it quickly, otherwise it wouldn't have been on the album. So he took the poster and began extracting its details. Almost every line in the song "Being for the Benefit of Mr. Kite" was taken directly from that Victorian circus poster. Mr. K, Mr. Kite, the Hendersons, who were late of Pablo Fonque's fair, even specific details about the attractions to be performed. It was all on the poster. The poster advertised that Mr. Kite would perform various amazing feats, jumping over men and horses, through hoops and garters, and as the climax, jumping through a hogshead of real fire. In this way, Mr. K will challenge the world, so went the dramatic and bombastic advertisement, typical of the Victorian era. The only detail Lennon changed was the horse's name. In the original poster, the horse wasn't called Henry, but Lennon felt Henry the horse sounded better poetically, so he changed it. This is a perfect example of how Lennon worked. He honored his source material, but wasn't afraid to change small details for artistic purposes. But this song wasn't just a transcription of the poster. Lennon and producer George Martin transformed it into an amazing psychedelic journey. They used various avant-garde studio techniques to create a surreal and dreamlike circus atmosphere. They recorded a harmonium organ and cut the tape into small pieces, then threw them in the air and recorded them again in random order. This created a chaotic and carnivalesque sound, perfect for depicting circus madness. There were also amazing sound effects, crowd sounds, steam organ, and the general atmosphere of a 19th century circus. Listeners truly felt transported back to the Victorian era, standing among the crowd watching these amazing attractions. Now, let's talk about Pablo Fonke, the character mentioned in the song as the owner of the circus where the Hendersons used to work. Pablo Fonke was a real person, and his story itself is extraordinary. His real name was William Darby, and he was born around 1796 in Norwich, England. What made Pablo Fonke so remarkable was that he was the first black circus owner in British history. This was a phenomenal achievement given the rampant racism and discrimination of the Victorian era. Fonke wasn't just a circus owner. He was a master horseman and talented acrobat who stood at the pinnacle of his profession. Fonke ran his circus very successfully for decades. He was known for spectacular performances and high professionalism. He became one of the most beloved circus impresarios of the Victorian era, earning respect and admiration from both white and black audiences. His circus traveled throughout Britain, entertaining thousands of people. Pablo Fonke's Circus Royal became a highly respected institution. When Fonke died in 1871, his obituary described him as universally respected, an extraordinary testimonial for a black man in the Victorian era. So when that 1843 poster ended up in John Lennon's hands more than 120 years later, it carried rich history. This wasn't just an ordinary circus advertisement. It was a document from an era when live entertainment was king, when the circus was the biggest show in town, and when stars like Pablo Fonke and Mr. Kite were major local celebrities. Lennon, with his brilliant artistic instinct, captured the essence of that era and transformed it into something entirely new. A psychedelic song celebrating the strangeness and wonder of the Victorian circus, while using the avant-garde aesthetics of the 1960s. Being for the benefit of Mr. Kite is a perfect example of how the Beatles connected past and present, how they took historical artifacts and gave them new life in a modern context. A poster that might have ended up in the trash or forgotten in a warehouse, instead became inspiration for one of the most innovative songs in rock history. Every time we hear this song, we're not just hearing 1967 creativity. We're also hearing echoes from 1843, from an era when traveling circus was one of the most popular forms of entertainment, and when characters like Mr. Kite and Pablo Fonke entertained crowds with their amazing feats. The year was 1966. The Beatles had reached the pinnacle of their success. They were the biggest band in the world, making fantastic amounts of money. Their albums and singles sold millions of copies. Their concerts sold out in minutes. Beatles merchandising was everywhere. They should have been among the richest people in Britain, but there was a big problem: British taxes. In the mid-1960s, the Labour government, under Prime Minister Harold Wilson, imposed what was called the super tax, an extraordinarily high income tax for the highest income bracket. What was the rate? 95%. Yes, you heard that correctly. 95%. This meant that for every pound the Beatles earned above a certain threshold, they could only keep 5 pence. The rest, 95 pence, had to be handed over to the government. George Harrison, usually the quietest and most spiritual Beatle, was extremely frustrated with this situation. He saw the fruits of the band's hard work, hours of studio recording, exhausting performances, tireless creativity, and then saw most of that result taken by the government. so he did what rock musicians typically do when they're angry. He wrote a song about it. Taxman became the opening track on the Revolver album, and it's a very direct complaint about the tax burden they faced. What's interesting about Taxman is that Harrison didn't just complain, he specifically named the politicians responsible. In the middle of the song, lines mention two names, Mr. Wilson and Mr. Heath. Harold Wilson was the prime minister from the Labour Party, who served from 1964 to 1970. Under his leadership, the 95% super tax was imposed. Wilson and his Labour government believed in wealth redistribution and used progressive taxation as a tool to achieve greater economic equality. Edward Heath, on the other hand, was the leader of the Conservative Party and Wilson's political rival. Heath later became prime minister from 1970 to 1974. He once complained that there was too much taxation chasing too little income, a comment that would certainly resonate with the Beatles. But here's what's interesting. Even though Heath didn't support the 95% tax rate, and even though he was the opposition to Wilson's policies, Harrison put his name in the song to provide some political balance. The Beatles were aware that their fan base was very politically diverse. Many of their fans were working-class, labor voters who supported Wilson's progressive tax policies. By mentioning both politicians from both major parties, Harrison showed that his complaint wasn't about partisan politics. It was about the basic principle that 95% is too much, regardless of who's in power. This was a protest against the system, not against a particular political party. Musically, Taxman is one of the Beatles' hardest and most rock songs at that time. Its driving bass line, aggressive guitar solo, played by Paul McCartney, not George Harrison, and Harrison's sarcastic vocals create the perfect energy for this protest song. The lyrics are very direct and full of irony. Harrison speaks from the perspective of the tax collector himself, casually explaining how he'll take most of your income. If you drive a car, I'll tax the street. If you try to sit, I'll tax your seat. If you get too cold, I'll tax the heat. If you take a walk, I'll tax your feet. This is hyperbole, of course, but it captures the feeling that the government was taxing everything they could tax. What's ironic is that although the Beatles complained about taxes in this song, the 95% super tax actually drove many British musicians and celebrities to become more creative in their financial management. Some moved to countries with lower taxes, as some British rock stars eventually did in the 1970s. Others found legal ways to minimize their tax burden. Taxman became an anthem for anyone who felt the government was taking too much of their income. It resonated not only with the wealthy, but with anyone who felt their tax contributions weren't proportionate to the services they received from the government. And although that 95% tax rate is long gone, Britain significantly lowered its top tax rate in subsequent years. Taxman remains relevant as an expression of universal frustration with heavy tax burdens. December 1966. London was at the height of the swinging 60s era. The city was the center of fashion, music, and youth culture. Carnaby Street was filled with trendy boutiques. Nightclubs like Ad Lib and Scotch of St. James became gathering places for celebrities and socialites. In the midst of this glamorous scene, there was a group of wealthy young people known as the Swinging London Set, children of aristocratic and wealthy families who spent their time at lavish parties, driving expensive sports cars, and enjoying a hedonistic lifestyle. One of the most famous members of this set was Tara Brown. At age 21, Tara was a Guinness heir. Yes, the family that owned the famous brewery company. He was handsome, wealthy, and popular. He was a close friend of many musicians, including the Beatles and the Rolling Stones. He embodied everything glamorous about 1960s London. But on December 18th, 1966, tragedy struck. Tara Brown was driving his blue Lotus Elan, a luxury sports car that was his favorite, through the streets of London at night. Beside him sat a model named Suki Podier. They may have been in a hurry, perhaps not paying close enough attention. At a crossroads in Earl's Court, something fatal happened. Tara didn't see, or didn't react quickly enough to, a traffic light turning red. His car collided with another vehicle. The crash was horrific. Tara suffered severe head injuries. He died the next day in the hospital. Tara Brown's death shocked the London scene. It was a brutal reminder that despite feeling untouchable, despite being young and wealthy, and life feeling like an endless party, tragedy could come at any moment. News of Tara's death spread widely in British newspapers. And one day, not long after the tragedy, John Lennon was sitting at his piano, reading the Daily Mail. He saw an article about Tara's accident. He may have known Tara personally, or at least knew of him from the London scene. The article left a deep impression on Lennon. Lennon began writing. He later explained that he wrote "A Day in the Life" with the Daily Mail propped in front of him on the piano. The article about Tara Brown became inspiration for the opening lines of what would become, according to many critics, the Beatles' greatest song. The opening lines are now iconic and haunting. He read the news today about a lucky man who made the grade, an ambiguous expression that could mean achieving success or reaching the end of life. And though the news was rather sad, Lennon had to laugh. Not a dismissive laugh, but a nervous, uncomfortable laugh. The kind of laugh that emerges when we confront the absurdity and tragedy of life. He saw the photograph in the newspaper, perhaps a photo of the wrecked Lotus, or of Tara himself. And then came the most evocative line. He blew his mind out in a car. He didn't notice that the lights had changed. Blew his mind out is a genius phrase in its ambiguity. On one level, it refers to the fatal head injury Tara suffered. On another level, in 1960s slang, blow your mind meant experiencing something very intense or using psychedelic drugs. Lennon played with both meanings, creating an image that was simultaneously literal and metaphorical. What makes this song more than just about Tara's accident is how Lennon and Paul McCartney, who contributed to the middle section, used it as a meditation on modern life. A Day in the Life became a collage of ordinary moments, reading the newspaper, watching a film, catching a bus, interspersed with profound moments about mortality and meaning. The middle section of the song, written and sung by McCartney, takes a different perspective. The perspective of an ordinary person, rushing in the morning, almost missing the bus, hurrying into class, and then daydreaming. It's a perfect contrast to Tara's tragedy. A reminder that while some lives end dramatically and prematurely, for most people, life continues with its usual routines. The musical climax of the song, the orchestra building to a terrible crescendo, and finally, the famous E major piano chord that lasts more than 40 seconds, is one of the most iconic moments in rock history. It's a sonic representation of consciousness exploding, of reality shattering, perhaps of the moment of death itself. Tara Brown, the young man who died too soon, probably never knew his death would inspire what many consider the greatest rock song ever made. But strangely and unexpectedly, his tragedy became immortalized in music. Every time A Day in the Life is played, Tara's story is retold, and listeners are reminded of life's fragility and how ordinary moments can suddenly turn to tragedy. December 1966. London was at the height of the swinging 60s era. The city was the center of fashion, music, and youth culture. Carnaby Street was filled with trendy boutiques. Nightclubs like Ad-Lib and Scotch of St. James became gathering places for celebrities and socialites. In the midst of this glamorous scene, there was a group of wealthy young people known as the Swinging London Set. Children of aristocratic and wealthy families who spent their time at lavish parties, driving expensive sports cars, and enjoying a hedonistic lifestyle. One of the most famous members of this set was Tara Brown. At age 21, Tara was a Guinness heir. Yes, the family that owned the famous brewery company. He was handsome, wealthy, and popular. He was a close friend of many musicians, including the Beatles and the Rolling Stones. He embodied everything glamorous about 1960s London. But on December 18, 1966, tragedy struck. Tara Brown was driving his blue Lotus Elan, a luxury sports car that was his favorite, through the streets of London at night. Beside him sat a model named Suki Podier. They may have been in a hurry, perhaps not paying close enough attention. At a crossroads in Earl's Court, something fatal happened. Tara didn't see, or didn't react quickly enough to, a traffic light turning red. His car collided with another vehicle. The crash was horrific. Tara suffered severe head injuries. He died the next day in the hospital. Tara Brown's death shocked the London scene. It was a brutal reminder that despite feeling untouchable, despite being young and wealthy, and life feeling like an endless party, tragedy could come at any moment. News of Tara's death spread widely in British newspapers. And one day, not long after the tragedy, John Lennon was sitting at his piano, reading the Daily Mail. He saw an article about Tara's accident. He may have known Tara personally, or at least knew of him from the London scene. The article left a deep impression on Lennon. Lennon began writing. He later explained that he wrote "A Day in the Life" with the Daily Mail propped in front of him on the piano. The article about Tara Brown became inspiration for the opening lines of what would become, according to many critics, the Beatles' greatest song. The opening lines are now iconic and haunting. He read the news today about a lucky man who made the grade, an ambiguous expression that could mean achieving success or reaching the end of life. And though the news was rather sad, Lennon had to laugh. Not a dismissive laugh, but a nervous, uncomfortable laugh. The kind of laugh that emerges when we confront the absurdity and tragedy of life. He saw the photograph in the newspaper, perhaps a photo of the wrecked Lotus, or of Tara himself. And then came the most evocative line. He blew his mind out in a car. He didn't notice that the lights had changed. Blew his mind out is a genius phrase in its ambiguity. On one level, it refers to the fatal head injury Tara suffered. On another level, in 1960s slang, blow your mind meant experiencing something very intense or using psychedelic drugs. Lennon played with both meanings, creating an image that was simultaneously literal and metaphorical. What makes this song more than just about Tara's accident is how Lennon and Paul McCartney, who contributed to the middle section, used it as a meditation on modern life. A Day in the Life became a collage of ordinary moments, reading the newspaper, watching a film, catching a bus, interspersed with profound moments about mortality and meaning. The middle section of the song, written and sung by McCartney, takes a different perspective. The perspective of an ordinary person, rushing in the morning, almost missing the bus, hurrying into class, and then daydreaming. It's a perfect contrast to Tara's tragedy. A reminder that while some lives end dramatically and prematurely, for most people, life continues with its usual routines. The musical climax of the song, the orchestra building to a terrible crescendo, and finally, the famous E major piano chord that lasts more than 40 seconds, is one of the most iconic moments in rock history. It's a sonic representation of consciousness exploding, of reality shattering, perhaps of the moment of death itself. Tara Brown, the young man who died too soon, probably never knew his death would inspire what many consider the greatest rock song ever made. But strangely and unexpectedly, his tragedy became immortalized in music. Every time A Day in the Life is played, Tara's story is retold, and listeners are reminded of life's fragility and how ordinary moments can suddenly turn to tragedy. We've taken a journey through 6 Beatles songs, each carrying its own historical footprint. From the civil rights movement to Victorian circus, from London socialite tragedy to suffocating government taxes. From a young girl running away to a long-forgotten airline, the Beatles touched various aspects of the world around them. What makes the Beatles' approach so special is how they integrated these historical and contemporary elements into their music. They didn't make dry documentary songs or didactic protests. Instead, they took moments from real life and transformed them into universal and timeless art. Blackbird isn't just about the civil rights movement. It's about anyone struggling to find their freedom. She's Leaving Home isn't just about Melanie Coe. It's about the universal generation gap. Being for the Benefit of Mr. Kite isn't just about an old circus poster. It's about the wonder and strangeness that can be found in artifacts from the past. What's remarkable is that all these references, though they came from very specific contexts, managed to communicate with listeners from various eras and cultures. Someone in 2025 can hear A Day in the Life and feel its emotional impact, even if they know nothing about Tara Brown or the swinging London scene. This is the mark of truly great songwriting. The ability to take the specific and make it universal, to take the temporal and make it eternal. The Beatles were masters of this art. They also showed us that inspiration can come from anywhere, not just from personal experience or internal emotions, but from newspaper headlines, from antique posters in thrift shops, from today's politics, from tragedies befalling people we know or don't know. The Beatles taught us to pay attention to the world around us, to let history, both large and small, inform our art. They showed that pop music doesn't have to be shallow or escapist. It can engage with real issues, can document important moments, can make political or social statements, all while remaining accessible and enjoyable entertainment. In many ways, these songs are time capsules. They capture particular moments in history. The 1960s with all its turbulence, creativity, and social transformation. But like good time capsules, they also contain something that transcends their moment. Truths about human nature, about our struggles and hopes, about the absurdity and beauty of life. When we listen to these songs today, we're not just hearing great music. We're hearing echoes from a bygone era, voices from people whose lives, their stories, and even their deaths became part of a generation's soundtrack. We hear about black women in America fighting for their rights, about a young girl feeling lonely despite being surrounded by luxury, about Victorian circus performers challenging the world with their amazing feats, about politicians making decisions about taxes affecting millions of lives, about a young socialite who died too soon, and about an airline that once carried people across the world. All these stories, all these historical moments have been immortalized in Beatles music. And as long as people continue listening to these songs, and they certainly will as long as there's music, these stories will continue to live. This is the true power of great art. It doesn't just reflect its own time, it transcends its time and speaks to all times. The Beatles understood this intuitively. They knew that by telling specific stories with honesty and skill, they could create something universal and timeless. And perhaps that's the greatest lesson we can take from today's exploration of historical references in Beatles songs. That history isn't something distant and abstract. It's a collection of individual moments, of lives lived, of decisions made, of tragedies experienced, of joys felt, and that the best art doesn't distance itself from this history, but embraces it, weaves it into its fabric, and in the process, helps us understand both our past and present better. The Beatles may never have intended to be historians, but in many ways, that's what they became. They documented their era, not in the objective and detached way of history textbooks, but in the emotional, personal, and artistic way of great songwriting. And their documentation, their songs, will continue to tell generation after generation what it was like to live in the 1960s, what people cared about at that time, how they saw the world, and their place in it. Every time we press play on these songs, we're not just hearing music, we're opening a window into history, and in the process, we learn something valuable about the timeless human condition that connects us all, regardless of when or where we live. That is the Beatles' true legacy, not just brilliant music, but a deep connection between art and life, between song and story, between melody and memory. And that's a legacy that will continue to resonate as long as music matters to humanity.